Welcome back to The Roll Up. In today's conversation, we sat down with Alejo, one of the founders of Lumio, to discuss a lot of the current topics in the zeitgeist of crypto today, such as asynchronous composability versus synchronous composability, whether atomic composability and execution are achievable, the difference between shared sequencing, centralized sequencing, and the trade-offs to the execution layer. Lumio is building an interesting VM abstraction framework, which we talked about bringing apps from Solana onto the superchain and the idea behind their framework. As always, enjoy a quick word from our sponsors and let's jump right in.
Welcome aboard on our journey into the singularity. This is the endgame roadmap for Frax and Fraxtal, the new L2 out of the Frax ecosystem that is totally based on fractal scaling. Fraxtal is a modular L2 blockchain built by Frax with modular and fractal scaling in mind. Fractal scaling is based on the Mandelbrot set of fractal images, and it explains how L2s become L3s and the entire app chain lifecycle goes through its evolution. The Frax ecosystem is made of some of the top builders in the space and has stemmed from its OG days of the Frax stablecoin. It is now in the LST space, the LRT space, and this Fraxtal L2 joins the existing suite of Frax products, including Frax Swap and Frax Lend. You can see Frax Ferry, the bridge to go from any chain, Arbitrum, Optimism, or mainnet into the Fraxtal mainnet, bridge your tokens, and bring your Frax assets into the Fraxtal ecosystem. Join today to get the best out of Fraxtal. You are still early. Join today, take part in our expedition into the singularity.
Everclear is pioneering the clearing layer. The clearing layer can almost be thought of as splitwise when you go on a trip with friends, but for the blockchain. What I mean by that is when users are sending cross-chain messages, there's oftentimes fillers and solvers who have balances left on different chains that they need to rebalance and reset their positions. This is where Everclear comes in. Everclear is pioneering a collaborative approach to the chain abstraction future, and they are willing to work with interoperability partners, solvers, and other providers in the space to build a interoperable and chain abstraction future. Please check out Everclear at everclear.org and welcome back to the roll-up. Today we have another episode leading up to EthCC. We're really looking forward to that and seeing many of you guys out there. Today we have our friend Alejo from Pontem Network, now also working on Lumio, which we're going to dive into in the Modular VM Abstraction realm. Talking a lot about the execution layer today, and some recent conversations in the zeitgeist about composability, amongst other things. Looking forward to this one. Rob, good morning. Play any golf recently, or just hitting the range?
I did. No, I played pretty recently, and in Florida, it does get pretty hot. So it was about 100 degrees Fahrenheit out there, and I had my girlfriend with me, and I think she was feeling a little bit, and we got it was hot. It was hot. I think I was getting a bit delirious out there, What's that?
It's the TLDR of Florida.
Pretty much. Alejo, you're based in Florida, right?
Yeah, South Florida, near Palm Beach.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's hot down here.
Rob's got a girlfriend, so it's a bull market. We can all understand that. Maybe not in the short term, but it's a bull market for builders. Lots of raises going on, lots of new teams shipping. Rob's smiling, as he should. Welcome, Alejo, to the roll up. As you can see, we're going to have a friendly but technical conversation today. Looking forward to it. So second time on, but kind of since then, Lumio has almost kind of morphed into its own. So maybe you can give us and our community a kind of a quick update as to what you guys have been up to.
Yeah, definitely. So we're expanding the virtual machine framework that we're building. So essentially you can build with various virtual machines. The goal is to support all the ones that are going to be popular for developers. Right now we support Solana VM, Move VM, and Parallel EVM. And the goal really is to allow developers to build once and deploy everywhere. So essentially maintaining full compatibility with the virtual machine. So no code changes need to be made, and they can just deploy onto the shared sequencers of popular L2s like Optimism, Arbitrum, and where there is no L2s currently, we'll be building our own sequencer and deploying rollups. So that's the environment that we're building on Solana. And right now we're on testnet on Optimism, and very soon going to be on testnet on Solana.
Love it. And this is something that's been talked about quite a bit recently, at least between John Charbonneau and Vitalik. And I know you had some thoughts, but basically Vitalik made a post saying that he doesn't believe that atomic synchronous composability is that important, which I think kind of ruffled some feathers, but a lot of people actually agreed with it. You agreed with it maybe in some parts, but also had some other opinions. Maybe we can kind of unpack this composability question and then bring it back to how it relates to Lumio and kind of what you're building.
Yeah, definitely. Building on Solana, you kind of take the blue Kool-Aid of sorts of having one global state machine, which at times can be at odds with this modularity and narrative. So it's kind of interesting hearing the pros and cons of each. I think a lot of this is somewhat biased by the bags that each of the proponents hold. So Tolly is definitely going to be a big proponent for a single atomic state. I'm not sure how that scales as infinitely as something like horizontally scaled rollups that share a sequencer or share one settlement layer. But yeah, it's interesting because Vitalik essentially noted that most of the use cases that people have is just essentially swapping assets or sending the same asset that they have, let's say a version of wrapped ETH, to another rollup. Whereas having one single atomic state, you can still have very easy developer experience for doing cross-contract calls, for example, or enabling use cases like flash loans. I do think all these use cases can still happen across asynchronous environments. I think infrastructure like intent-based infrastructure that relies on off-chain entities like market makers to essentially in one block do the use case that you'd have through a synchronous contract call. It's still possible, but yeah, it's interesting to see how you're having this very divergent path for scalability, especially because Ethereum, at least to the best of my knowledge, was doing a lot of research on sharding, so actually scaling the L1 for a very long time. And at a period, the Ethereum Foundation, a lot of the research is now going towards this rollup-centric roadmap, which in its current state is having these problems with synchronous calls. It's very hard, and there's levels of trust that need for interactions between different rollups like Arbitrum and Optimism, for example, or Polygon. And Kalsamani even made a post of this recently where he showed all the different versions of wrapped ETH, and essentially showing that, hey, it's like a very bad user experience to have all these versions of wrapped ETH, and then if you want to use them across different applications, it's not very doable. Obviously, this goes away if you're just in one single atomic state or an L1 like Solana. But then there's limits that we're seeing today on the actual scaling, right? So Solana is reaching 2,000 to 3,000 TPS. I do think with upgrades like FireDancer to the hardware, we'll get to see that scale more linearly, but at least through different environments, different rollups that each have their own bandwidth, you can get that linear scaling now today a lot easier. And it's still unproven, or at least not done yet, scaling an L1 horizontally beyond 100,000 TPS, right? And if we are going to get to billions of people using this stuff concurrently, if we are going to have a lot of the world's financial infrastructure, we need to think beyond 100,000 TPS. It's not just going to be payment rails. It's also going to be, ideally all the applications that we use like Uber, Salesforce, etc. So yeah, I think in essence, I do kind of agree with Vitalik that maybe, for most use cases, asynchronous is not great, or is not the worst thing to have. But I do think there is value and merit in trying to scale the base layer as much as possible, because even then it still gives you a good base for everything that can come on top. And similarly to us deploying on Solana and L2, bringing a lot of the same architecture that is scaling Ethereum. Goes to show that a lot of what is being learned and being researched and developed on Ethereum can also be applicable to other L1s and helping solve problems for developers today, like customizing the runtime for different VMs is one example and one use case that we're doing, but also bringing latency down exponentially. We recently saw a game on Solana, I believe it's called Magic Block, that is able to get the latency down substantially below 100 milliseconds. And when you're posting a lot of transactions on chain for the game, you don't want lag to essentially affect the user experience. So that's something that you wouldn't be able to do on the L1 unless you're working with the L1 to bring that latency down, for example, or have that level of customizability to add different VMs. So it boils down to trade-offs, and it's interesting. And we should definitely continue to have these discussions between this behemoths of blockchain, because we can never be over-invested in one thing. And it's good to move these forward in different ways and let the market play out and see what gets adopted.
Yeah. It's cool to see these conversations happen out in the open on Twitter. And I think this sort of speaks to like the nature of Lumio's design as well, because you guys are deployed on Solana, and then you're also deployed on the super chain. And so I think that's a pretty unique experience. And it also speaks to the build once, deploy everywhere nature of the technology that you mentioned earlier. And so I'm curious, in the context of these shared sequencers and like sequencing in general, let's talk about the super chain and just kind of focus on that area. When these different L2s plug into the super chain, what's going on at the sequencing level? I realize there's like a revenue sharing program. Does Optimism have its own sequencer? Do these kind of have their own sequencer and then plug into a shared sequencer, which is the Optimism one? How are we thinking about this maybe at the L2 level, and then we can kind of draw the connection to the L1 level?
Yeah, definitely. So shared sequencing, something to keep in mind is that it's at the forefront of R&D for Ethereum. I would say the one that is furthest along, probably an implementation that I've seen and read a lot about, is Espresso. And they're looking at different ways to do sequencing, shared sequencing. One of them, and we can dive into this as well, is using base sequencing, which actually uses the L1 validators to propose the blocks and put them together, as opposed to having a centralized sequencer, which is the standard now for most rollups on Ethereum. So a centralized sequencer is essentially a node or a server that the Optimism Foundation or Arbitrum or the Arbitrum Foundation essentially controls. And the whole role of the sequencer and the execution environment is essentially to just order the transactions that are going to get passed through the state transition function, so that Alice sends an asset to Bob, for example. It just updates the ledger. So the role of the sequencer is very important, because obviously it can, if acting maliciously or gets taken down, it can impact the liveness of the network. We've seen this even in production. Arbitrum has had some downtime on their centralized sequencer. And then there's fallbacks in case these centralized sequencers do get compromised, where users can still force through transactions back to the L1. The most important transaction you want to do is withdrawals of assets. So it's important to keep in mind that on L2s, there is still a bridge where essentially you deposit assets into this environment. A deposit is just a transaction that syncs between the L1 and the L2 of saying, for example, move ETH to the L2. And then the most important thing you want to be able to do is withdraw those assets back. So in case the sequencer is ever compromised, there's a fallback mechanism, or what they call an escape hatch, where if there is some liveness issues or the sequencer acts maliciously, users can still withdraw their funds. So right now, because this is, again, an area of active research, most of the in production implementations are using these centralized sequencers. And the stated goal of each of these has been to decentralize the sequencer, because that adds more decentralization, more guarantees of liveness, given that it's not just one single party that can potentially censor transactions that are going through or be a central point of failure. And one interesting and very important feature that a shared sequencer enables is that when you have all these different environments that are compatible with each other in the Optimism ecosystem, they're all built with the OP stack. You can essentially start to do transaction or cross chain messaging or contract calls between different environments. So when you're ordering the block, you can essentially include two transactions from different environments that call a contract from, let's say, Optimism to Base. So you could do something like a flash loan, let's say, with an Aave implementation on OP mainnet that calls, let's say, an aerodrome contract call on Base. So yeah, that's one really good feature of a shared sequencer, which essentially starts to bring together these different environments. Whereas right now, each individual L2 has their own centralized sequencer, but I believe this is mainly due to the technology itself not being ready for production to really move these billions of dollars at stake that are, on Optimism and Arbitrum into these decentralized sequencers. But yeah, this is essentially where we want to go. This is now. I'm sure you're familiar with the stages of rollups. These are, I guess, somewhat subjective on what they should be, but a lot of people would agree that a shared sequencer and a decentralized sequencer is important for this. Also, I might have somewhat used a misnomer here, but there's also an important distinction between shared sequencing and decentralized sequencing, because you can still have one single shared sequencer where different rollups make calls, and you can have these synchronous or asynchronous contract calls between the rollups. And then there's a decentralized sequencer, which many look essentially like a proof of stake system or a Byzantine fault tolerant BFT system, where you have different leaders that then become the quote unquote sequencers that are organizing these transactions. So the end goal is having both shared and decentralized sequencing, which should be, as trustless or as resilient as an L1 itself. And yeah, the current state of the market is most of these are centralized sequencers that could have liveness issues or could act maliciously. But the goal is to transition to this, and you get benefits like, for example, this message passing that can happen between the different ecosystems. So one that definitely look up to is Expresso. A lot of the research that they're doing on joining different rollups and having standards for this message passing and for sequencing across different rollups is important. And I believe a lot of the contributions to that have come also from the Arbitrum team. So I think we'll see some standards come about. And the interesting question that we should look at, or the interesting topic that we should look at, is whether there'll be shared sequencing or standards between these different federations of L2s that are popping up. So, for example, will we ever see synchronous or close to synchronous transactions between an Optimism and OP stack rollup and an Arbitrum orbit or an Arbitrum rollup? I think that's still TBD. I would imagine, for Ethereum to really scale and feel like, having one UX and being competitive with Solana, we're definitely going to want to see this. And yeah, that goes back to the conversation earlier on Vitalik's point of view that maybe having composability, synchronous composability, isn't that important, given that that's the current state of Ethereum, where it's very hard to do a contract call that's low latency and doesn't feel like really bad user experience between Optimism and Arbitrum, the two major L2s. But the market's definitely going in a direction where hopefully we'll see some standards that enable these to essentially have composable as possible and have really low latency between calls between these different environments.
Yeah, I mean, that's the result of the trade-off that Ethereum's faced with the rollup centric roadmap, where it's like, okay, we are going to scale horizontally with rollups, which, if you kind of think about it, almost seems like scaling vertically, because people associate L1 and L2 as being above, but it's really it's more like a shard, if you will. And so as a result, then you kind of, we're currently battling this, like we call it here on the rollup, like modular fragmentation problem, where having all these different chains and having to kind of put them together. But then if we kind of take a step back to where we were in the beginning, when you were kind of explaining some of the trade-offs between, Solana and their TPS and kind of scaling a single state machine, I was speaking with a unmentioned person from the Monad team, and they were asking me, like, should we just centralize more to scale? like this is the question that they're basically faced with, is like, okay, we can achieve this much TPS, but we could also get this much if we, this much more if we centralize more. And so these single state machines are almost fighting this latency problem of physics, where you can only have, a message from different parts of the world can only be sent so fast to each other. The speed of light is only so fast. And so you kind of are forced to centralize more with more cores and more machines in a single geographical location, which of course has like censorship resistant effects, decreasing of decentralization, et cetera, et cetera. And so shared sequencing is kind of like, okay, we've chosen this path in the Ethereum scaling roadmap, as well as like in the way that like the modular thesis kind of makes sense of scaling with more chains, more horizontal scaling, more execution environments. And so shared sequencing is kind of like, okay, now we have to put them all together. And I'm kind of seeing this as being like the next logical iteration of this roadmap, being this idea of, okay, how do we bring these all together? How do we bring apps from all these different chains together, shared sequencing? And so, I mean, what you guys are working on at Lumio as well. And so curious, like, any thoughts on that trade-off conversation as well, and as well as this kind of fragmentation arc that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and they're having essentially the same thought processes and arguments in their heads, right? Because, for example, a beefier sequencer or a node that can process transactions on an L2 faster, those come with those trade-offs, right? So, yes, you can have, for example, like a really beefy in terms of hardware, really high hardware requirements that can process transactions really fast. But then as you start to decentralize that sequencer, necessitating more machines to essentially run those transactions, you run into the same issues that you have on the L1, right? And then it comes down to, the trade-offs of decentralization versus performance that, most people would argue, I guess, today that it doesn't really matter. Like, most people are not thinking about decentralization as an important component of a blockchain, but it's the kind of thing where you really only care about it when there's a black swan event. So one example that I like to give is a lot of these L1s that necessitate really beefy hardware are run on public cloud infrastructure. And yes, you have individual entities that are running those instances on the public cloud. But what happens if there's some collusion across state actors or these public cloud providers to just ban crypto from running or ban validators from running these public cloud providers? A lot of them, you only need 1/3 of the validators to go down for liveness to be impacted. So yes, and then a lot of people in Solana make the argument, okay, then you should be running bare metal in your basement. But that's not as easy as running like a Raspberry Pi with a Ethereum node, right? So I guess the trade-off then still exists on centralization versus performance, but now we're moving to a layer up the stack where, as we mentioned earlier, if the sequencer is compromised, it's not the end of the world. People can still force through their transactions, go back to the L1, potentially use other sequencers that get bootstrapped, again, that aren't acting maliciously or uncompromised. So you're essentially having the same arguments, but now it's on what I would argue maybe like a less important or less foundational part of the blockchain system, that's essentially just connecting these off-chain computations that are happening on the L2 back to the L1. And I think in my opinion that's an important trade-off to make, because decentralization will really matter, and these black swan events, like if God forbid World War III breaks out or something, right? And then these blockchains you need to be essentially very resilient for it to still maintain neutrality and not have these wars of validators essentially, maintaining state. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important to still have decentralization. That's why I think Bitcoin and Ethereum are important to continue. But the innovations that are happening on Solana and Aptos, these alternative L1s, Monad, that are using more centralization for performance is applicable to a lot of use cases. And I do wonder whether if some black swan event happens, that it'll just make these L2s even more resilient and even more of a use case for people to trust. And like theoretically, you could have very similar user experience on an L2. Obviously, there's still some throttling that needs to happen to push transactions back to the L1. But yeah, I think we just need to think of these trade-offs, and then you're thinking about, okay, now I'm making these trade-offs, but which component or which layer of the stack am I making these trade-offs on? And I think on the settlement layer, we really need to be careful of not forgetting about the true value of blockchain, which is decentralization from state level actors. I think that was like Satoshi's original vision, to have a form of money that was for the people, by the people, and that can definitely potentially, and I mean it's yet to be tested, but potentially be an issue with these high performance L1s and these beefier sequencer L2s. But always having that fallback, is important. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of trade-offs, and we're seeing it now happening at the L2 as we do on the L1s.
Covalent is solving the long-term data availability problem, where a lot of the data availability providers today in the modular space, when you post data to them, they actually only hold that data for about 12 to 16 days. And then it's basically, it can go into an archive node, or oftentimes it's just kind of put away into the abyss. And what Covalent's trying to do is build this long-term data availability solution, which can plug into some of these modular data availability providers and provide this longer-term perpetual data solution. So what we try to think of this as is when you post transaction data onto Celestio or Veil or any of these modular DA solutions, or even Ethereum, Covalent is able to provide a long-term data storage and data availability platform for that data after the time period. Blockchains are billboards, not databases, and we need these providers in the space to be able to kind of hold on to the long-term data that is provided from these providers and these blockchain state. This is where Covalent comes in. They just had a nice rebrand. Check them out on Twitter as well as the website. Thank you for being here. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Mantle is a layer 2 blockchain with one of the biggest on-chain treasuries in all of crypto, and they have a 100-day campaign called Metamorphosis live now. What this is it is a campaign for their liquid staked ETH token, METH, as well as their upcoming liquid restaking token, CMETH, where you can utilize this token on the Mantle network in a variety of different apps, some of your favorite restaking protocols and DeFi protocols, and earn yields in the form of powder, which will eventually be turning into a governance token. Mantle's been around for a while. We like them because they use their own form of EigenDA. They have a good ecosystem and they're growing. So check out this 100-day Metamorphosis campaign, and hope you guys enjoy the rest of this video.
Yeah, there's some really good points there as far as not sacrificing the core ethos at the settlement layer. Kind of everybody has to make those trade-offs, right, as well. And so, for more performant applications, more expressive applications, things that require more performance, but maybe less financial value or less value, which can be inherently not able to be destroyed and then recreated easily. Having those on much more secure chains, I think, is important. And I think, I have friends asking me, like, why is Ethereum even a thing? And I think Ethereum's in this weird spot where, like, there's all these more performant, cheaper smart contract platforms, but like Ethereum got the ETF for a reason, and I don't think there's going to be any other ETFs that are going to pass for other chains. Ethereum has like this massive builder community for a reason, and so I think having that like core ethos at its whole is super important. Kind of shifting gears a bit to a conversation that I think that you're going to be quite fond of is something that I've been in the trenches battling crypto Twitter for some time on, which is that like there's all these like modular infra being built, but the question keeps coming up is like, okay, where's the apps, and like why are we not building applications, and why is there no demand for applications? And we kind of just can be real with ourselves about where we are with the applications, is that we're still struggling, I think, crypto to hit like this product market fit for apps. So you guys are building a solution where you can port different apps from different execution environments to other execution environments, kind of bringing these apps over. Maybe we can talk about how you're seeing this app landscape, and how you think builders are going to answer the question of where are the apps, and maybe like what are the obstacles, just kind of general higher level on where we are with this app question.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that with that sentiment. I mean, my dad or my grandma isn't really using crypto for a reason, and I think there's a ton of barriers to entry. Like even just custodying your private key is a huge barrier to entry for most people. But I would say the main killer app for crypto is here, and we've been using it for a while, and it's money. Even just as a store of value, as a way to transact value with each other. No smart contract application needs to be built, and Bitcoin showed us that. All you really need is something that can sustain value, can be traded between people, can be a store of value. It's not going to degrade over time. And, we have that in Bitcoin. I think ETH is starting to get there also, having what people call a monetary premium. So essentially, money itself, I think, is the first killer app. But to people's point, we want to see games. We want to see more consumer-facing apps, social network apps being built. And I think that's possible, and it's definitely happening today, albeit slowly. And a function of this, I believe, is also just where the investment has been going. And even in traditional venture capital, infrastructure or platforms are a lot higher ROI traditionally than end user consumer applications. Obviously, there's exceptions. Although Amazon, I would argue, is kind of both, right? They have both AWS and they have the Amazon e-commerce. But there is end user consumer apps that these applications, these infrastructure are going to need. And today, I think it's decentralized finance. I think it's financial applications. So on top of money, not only can you just store value and hold it, but now you can also trade. You can also do credit. You can also do these complex financial products like perpetual futures, derivatives, options, all within a computer that is not controlled by anybody. And I think that paradigm shift is here now. And unfortunately, the issues that exist is that it's not really connected to the rest of the world. So the first connection, I think, is stablecoins. You're starting to see people being able to, for example, use USDC, which is a derivative of the US dollar, as collateral for betting on the market of Bitcoin or the market of ETH going up or down. That's something like GMX or Drift. And I think that's the applications that have product market fit today. If we can continue expanding that to more real world assets, for example, treasury yields, stocks, all of this coming on chain and being able to be used, I think that's a killer use case that once people realize, if you have it all on one ledger, it can be a lot cheaper to operate. So for example, Robinhood, even though it's free, you still have a lot of payment, pay for order flow that happens. So you're actually paying, the worst price than you'd be paying if you were paying a fee. Obviously, before Robinhood, you'd have to pay a large fee just to trade one stock. So I do think that, moving into this intermediated application where you don't have a central party extracting value for these financial applications is that first killer app. But we do need to see, for example, ride sharing, food delivery, e-commerce, social gaming, all of that to come to light. And I think part of it is the infrastructure isn't there yet. And part of what it is as well is the actual vendor lock-in that exists of people, for example, only being able to build with Solidity, whereas most applications today are built with oftentimes not even just one language. WebAssembly, for example, is one of the most popular languages. Rust is one of the most popular languages. And application developers today, yes, they could learn Solidity, but it comes at the trade-off of having to learn all the different ways that Solidity can essentially break your app. And breaking your app and a decentralized application essentially means like users losing funds. So it's not just like a bug where, on Robinhood, let's say there was a bug and you like traded all your GameStop stock, but this is the wrong price or something. They could just roll back the ledger. These bugs definitely have a more higher impact on a smart contract application. So it really is still very hard for developers to come on board and just build, these applications as they normally would with WebAssembly or Rust. But those barriers, I would say, are going down. With a solution like we're building, developers can come in, they can build with Rust on the Solana VM, they can build with Move, which is a framework that is similar to Solidity. It looks like a TypeScript language, but it uses, it's designed after Rust using a resource model and static type safety. So, you're able to implement a lot of the same frameworks from traditional software development now into smart contracts. And I think that's going to unlock a lot of applications that can be built. And theoretically, like all the applications that exist today could be like quote unquote decentralized. And, we're starting to see the edge of that today. Like on Solana, for example, there's an app called Teleport that's essentially Uber for ride sharing. We're starting to see games on Solana. As I mentioned earlier, there's a game that can have the latency, very low latency, so that you can actually post transactions on chain. Those can be synchronized between players playing a multiplayer game. So I believe that infrastructure is still important because it's going to allow us to build these applications that traditional built on quote unquote Web 2. And now that that's there or getting there, these applications are getting into mainnet, being more widely adopted. The infrastructure is getting more widely adopted. Now the applications can essentially build as if they were building for traditional Web 2. Obviously, there's still some things to take into account, like custodying of assets, doing contract calls, as I mentioned. Any bug could potentially be detrimental to the entire app. But yeah, at least we'll start to see more of these being possible. And I think a large part of that is the infrastructure. It's a bit of a trope to say that it does feel like the early internet, 1970s, 1980s. 1990s, but it does kind of feel like that. Maybe we've evolved from the 70s to the 80s or 90s, where there's a kind of like a boom and a lot of applications, protocols being built, infrastructure, and a lot of those, I would say, in 10, 20 years down the line might not be around, but you're still going to see some winners, and you're going to see more people continuing to build and feel more comfortable building. And I think in another 10, 20 years, we are going to see this slow at first, but then potentially a tipping point of just more applications being built on the blockchain for its true value, and less applications being built on centralized servers. So yeah, I think the biggest competitor to blockchain is probably something like AWS or Google Cloud, and we'll see that play out over time.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think you mentioned Robinhood, and basically that's what they did. They stopped. They basically rolled back or stopped GME trading during that meme coin or meme stock craze, right? And so I think there is one value proposition of blockchain over and beyond databases like AWS and those cloud servers, where it is verifiable. And so no one can stop your trades. Robinhood can't stop it. League of Legends or World of Warcraft, they can't roll back your gun skin that you spent hours and hours playing. Though there is a tendency for companies to do that when it suits their interest, but it is a black swan event, like you mentioned. On a normal basis, Robinhood doesn't roll back trades. League of Legends doesn't roll back your gun skins because it's a disincentive. Like they know that they're going to lose some users in that event if they're going to misalign with their user base. And so on a normal basis, they don't do that, but it's the black swan events that sort of shift to this more verifiable, not my keys, not my coins, this more don't trust, verify type of mindset that blockchain provides over a database. So I think that is one way to kind of subvert Web 2 and cause this mass migration to Web 3 that I think a lot of us kind of want to see. I think a second way to potentially do this, but we're not quite there yet, is an incentives proposition, where at a certain point, I'd love to get your thoughts on whether or not this is feasible at even in the theoretical sense. Like right now, Web 2 game, there's games. If I'm a game developer, I'm going to look like, all right, well, is it cheaper for me to run my infrastructure on AWS or a blockchain? And I think right now we have this more general paradigm of, do I want to go cloud compute or do I want to go verifiably compute? If I go verifiable, I get the verification nature of it. All my users get the benefit from that. but I may be paying a higher infrastructure cost for that verifiability that maybe my users don't necessarily even need or want because they kind of just trust me not to roll back my ledger. So do you think we'll ever get to a point where verifiable computation is on par or more affordable than trad Web 2 cloud compute?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, today, blockchain is, let's say, slower, doesn't handle as much bandwidth as, a centralized AWS server. But let's say tomorrow, 5, 10 years down the line, you'll probably get the same user experience that you had today, that you have today for a AWS centralized server, right? Just as a function of Moore's law, technology and hardware is getting better. I think at a certain point, like it's, the human can't even tell the difference. So if you're having something like on a game happen at fractions of a second, 100 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, and a centralized server can do it at 20 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, like I feel like it stops mattering so much. Maybe for trading, it can still matter, obviously, because you can front run transactions, etc. But for most applications, I think it'll get there. And similar with storage costs, I think most of the costs come from storing the information. There are solutions today. I think 0G is a good example that they're like exponentially orders of magnitude making the cost of storage, not just for data availability, but it can be for anything. One of their best use cases seems to be AI. So I think the infrastructure tomorrow will get to the same point where we are today. And again, because it's decentralized, there'll still be some form of gap between the two. But at a certain point, that gap becomes, something that the human can't even perceive. So I think we'll get there. It's just a function of time and a function of just continuing to develop this infrastructure. The question we should ask is, if a user is given the choice of having this paradigm shift of owning their data, of that data not being owned by a centralized party, and the user experience is the same or indiscernible. Let's say Robinhood versus Uniswap, right? If they both feel the same, they both have a really snappy user experience on an app. You can trade all the stocks, all the assets, all the crypto assets. Like, which one would you rather use, right? The one that at any point in time, like you said, can be rolled back, or at the whim of people can be stopped, halting of trading, or one where due to the code it literally cannot, right? And then similarly with gaming, or even I think IoT is an interesting one, right? Like think of like your car, right? Like right now, the most advanced cars are like Tesla, where you have full self-driving starting to be implemented. In the future as well, I think that's just going to become the norm. Like, even your average Nissan is going to be able to have this full self-driving. And then you're going to like, I would personally be very weary of, a central actor or a company or a state actor being able to, control my car, right? Whereas like if it's on a blockchain and I know the code can be audited and no one can, stop or, direct me to go somewhere else off a cliff or whatever. And then the user experience is exactly the same. Like users are going to get smarter about the technology that's behind what they're using. I think something analogous is food, right? For a long period of time, like if you look at people in the 70s, there wasn't that much obesity. People were just eating normal food. In the 60s, 50s, you were just eating normal food. And then this came this like mass manufacturing of food and almost like propaganda by like big food to feed you this like ultra processed food, and not everybody started getting fat. But now we're like getting an awakening of realizing like, hey, this like ultra processed mass manufactured food is not that good. I want to just eat vegetables. I want to just eat, normal meat, not ultra packaged, ultra processed food. And it's just consumers becoming smarter about, what they're putting into their bodies. And I think generally that's going to happen with technology as well. And, if you're given the choice of using X that's decentralized or X that's not decentralized, like X, for example, at any point in time can ban your account, all your tweets, all your followers can just go away. Whereas using something like Lens, that's all in your control. You can just build a different interface and continue having that. So I think once users realize that, and we saw that trend with food, as I mentioned, I think we'll see it with technology, and that might be a tipping point for people.
You could extrapolate that to money too. Like,
Yeah.
what do you want to be putting in your bank account? Do you want to be putting this thing that depreciates 7% a year because, we print it all the time? Or do you want to, put something in your savings account that doesn't depreciate? It has limited inflation, right? And so I think there's a similar dilemma in people's minds when they're thinking about like consumer behavior, right? Do I want my money to be the US dollar? Or do I want it to be something like a little bit harder? Obviously trade-offs when it comes to convenience and how you spend it, but I think you're right about how consumer behavior shifts over time due to like this awakening that we get from more information coming in, more empirical research. All of that informs consumers' behavior.
Yeah, I think that's partly due to the internet. Like now everyone can just search like, oh, like what's actually, what is this ingredient that I can't pronounce? For money, yeah, it's a really interesting one. Like the US government has the infinite mint button, whereas Bitcoin, everyone would have to agree to print more than 21 million. The US government at any point in time can stop banks from, giving out US dollars through ATMs. They can stop you from moving that US dollar abroad or moving it elsewhere. Whereas, yeah, something like Bitcoin or Ethereum that, has algorithm that tells you exactly that you can project how much money you're going to have in the future. Like people are awakening to that. I think the ETFs is a large part of that. Obviously, I think Larry Fink and BlackRock are betting on, and they're betting on this store of value as being, competitive with gold and other stores of value. So yeah, the fact that like literally now everyone can have gold or this digital gold at their hands. They don't even need to access, they don't need to have an ID or, have access to anything other than a computer. I think is really powerful. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the first killer app is money, but that can extend to any application really. And I think it'll just take time for the infrastructure to be there and for users to kind of realize that if the user experience is the same, I probably want this product that lets me own and have sovereignty over the ability to use this and the data that's behind it. Whereas this other one that's owned by a central party that at any point in time can just change the outputs or change the outcomes of it.
Yeah, it's funny that because we've been doing this Bitcoin and beyond educational series, and so some of the guys have said that money is the only use case. And so there's this kind of like weird dichotomy where I think a lot of the Ethereum community has this grander vision of many apps and things, and whereas I think some of the Bitcoin community is just set on money being one of the main use cases. So I think for now that's like the easiest one to see. But yeah, I'm more of the idea that we see many apps. I mean, more experimentation is going to happen, and just things will just keep on accelerating, in my opinion, on the innovation front. So definitely some good points here, guys. I'd like to zoom in a bit more on some of the tech that you guys are building at Lumio, answer some questions that we fielded from the community, and just trying to get an understanding as to kind of how you see Lumio fitting into this kind of roll-up centric roadmap, this modular thesis. So I think like the first one is there's some misconception I think of Lumio being a movement competitor at the Move VM rollup level. So maybe you could explain kind of why or why not you are competitors or not, and kind of how you can help movement or how you can also help other rollups, kind of almost compete with each other or at least help to scale the entire ecosystem as a whole.
Cartesi is your home for app-specific rollups. At the forefront of developing new tools and platforms that enhance the capabilities of blockchain technology, Cartesi enables applications that are flexible and built to scale. Build on a full Linux environment and use traditional software libraries, but in blockchain development. Go to cartesi.io, that's cartesi.io, to learn more about building your own app chain today.
Yeah, definitely. The vision of Lumio is to be agnostic to the underlying environments and frameworks that it's integrating into. So we started out with Optimism, essentially forked the OP stack and made modifications so that first the Move virtual machine, now the Solana VM and Parallel EVM can essentially compile down to Reth, which is the client, OP Reth, which is the client that Optimism uses. Similarly, we can be compatible with the movement stack. So to enable alternative VMs like Solana VM, WebAssembly, etc., in addition to their core offering, which is the Move and EVM, or the EVM that compiles the Move. So in essence, yeah, we built this solution to be complementary so that we can join the shared sequencers, share revenue as applications deployed through our layer twos that we're deploying, and then very easily being able to use that same tech stack modified for another framework like Arbitrum Orbits or ZK Zinc the hyperchains. And essentially then we very narrowly focus on just maintaining the virtual machine component, whereas we benefit from all the upgrades and research that's going on at the rest of the stack for the L2s, like the batchers, the provers, the challengers. And yeah, in that way, we're in essence essentially complementary solutions to existing L2s on Ethereum. Now, where there isn't an existing L2 federation or network like on Solana, we are using existing frameworks like the OP stack to essentially develop our own, so we can still, not have to build everything out ourselves, or essentially, benefit from the upgrades that others are doing. But yeah, in essence, we're building this out to be very complementary to existing L2 solutions, and yeah, you'll see us continue to build and deploy on existing L2 frameworks. Movement is definitely one we're very excited about, and talking to that team there, Rushi has been able to garner a lot of interest around the Move virtual machine and all the benefits that it comes there. And yeah, I think we'll see a lot of builders, and so those that still want to build with Solana VM are coming from Solana because they have those applications already built, or Cosmos built out with WebAssembly can still come and deploy. So yeah, very excited about us being able to work in conjunction with the existing L2 frameworks, the ones that are established like Optimism and Arbitrum, and the ones that are up and coming like Movement.
Love it. Okay, great. Okay, so then how does Lumio work from a technical level then? Let's say I'm an app builder on Solana. I've got this app. I'd like to deploy my app on a different chain in the OP stack, or a different Arbitrum chain, or a different L2. Like technically speaking, how do you accomplish this? And maybe we can get into some of the benefits of these kind of this mechanism as well.
Yeah, definitely. So breaking down at its simplest components is essentially the virtual machines, which we're maintaining equivalence with the latest that are being maintained. So the Solana VM on Solana, the SVM on Solana, the Move VM, Aptos framework. They are making upgrades, believe it or not, even to these. So we'll maintain equivalence so that teams from Solana, teams from Aptos can just copy paste their code and then deploy it onto a layer 2 that's deployed on Optimism. So on Optimism, the way that Optimism works, they have Ethereum equivalents. So they essentially have even the same clients, Reth and Geth. And then for those that aren't familiar, you have the EVM that compiles down to Geth. Reth is one that's very exciting. The Paradigm team, Georgios, has been doing a lot of work around getting the Reth client to be ready for production. I believe it very recently went through audits, or it's going through audits right now. And that's going to improve, Rust client over Go client is going to be way better in performance and lowering the cost. So what we did was essentially modify the stack so that Move Virtual Machine or Solana Virtual Machine or Parallel EVM can target Reth specifically. We didn't go after Geth, just Reth on Optimism. And yeah, essentially you'll have full equivalence with the Solana VM that you would have on Solana. So you can just easily copy paste your code and deploy it onto Optimism, and then just make modifications to the front end so that people can connect to it.
Okay, so as a builder, it doesn't require actually that much outside of your current domain technical knowledge to accomplish this. That's kind of where Lumio comes in to make it somewhat simple, from my understanding. But then as a builder, why do I care about putting my app somewhere else? Why is that important to any builder?
Yeah, 100%. So I would say the most important thing is access to the native assets. So we definitely discussed earlier, some of the benefits of and trade-offs between a high performance layer 1 or something like Ethereum. And, as we talked about it, most users would care about that in a black swan event. But why users should care today is because they have ETH, or they have Sol, or they have APT, A lot of them have ETH, a lot of them have Bitcoin. So you could use, for example, ETH on Solana. You could use Layer 0 wormhole, but then you'd be trusting a bridge. A lot of hacks have happened on bridges. Generally wrapped assets still have some trust assumptions, whereas a Layer 2 over time can be made as trustless as possible, as trust minimized as possible, using fraud proofs or validity proofs. So then the ETH that you're getting, is quote unquote native ETH from Ethereum. So imagine an application on Solana, perp trading DEX that currently uses Sol for collateral. When deployed on Ethereum, you can now use ETH as collateral. So I can now go and using my native ETH, use that as collateral to trade perps on an application that I was normally using previously on Solana, where I could only use Sol, for example. So I would say that's the biggest benefit for end users. Users have a lot of different bags, and they can be loyal to individual applications. Maybe they really like the user experience, they have that token. They like the rewards, the community around a specific application, but they still want to have be able to use, for example, ETH as collateral for their applications. And as we see the L2 ecosystem on Bitcoin developing as well, very excited to also start integrating the Lumio framework into some of those. So I think Bitcoin is another one where a lot of users, I would say probably most users in crypto, have some Bitcoin. And they'll be able to use that for more complex applications that are built with the Solana VM on Solana, or the Move VM on Aptos, or the EVM on these layer 2. So I would say that's the biggest use case for an application developer, to be able to offer these native assets that only live on their base chains.
Yeah, helping applications deploy to Bitcoin would be really cool. I'm curious if you could walk us through an example of how this could look to a user. Let's take Uniswap. I think it's just like kind of it's like an application that everyone knows. And they also happen to be cross-chain, right? We've got Uniswap on Arbitrum, Uniswap on mainnet, Uniswap on this chain, that chain. So let's say Uniswap, was to go and build once, deploy everywhere to all of those chains. How would that change their existing offering to one that uses a single VM that deploys and settles onto all these different chains?
Yeah, Uniswap is a great example. If you were to go on the Uniswap app.uniswap.org, you connect your wallet. There's a drop down where you can essentially trade on Avalanche, you can trade on BNB. These are different L1s. You can trade on all the different L2s. These are different L1s that are compatible with the EVM. So Uniswap can already do this. With our solution, with the Lumio VM framework, they could do this as well on Solana. So they could also offer Solana assets that are bridged up from Solana that can be traded on Uniswap. So Uniswap is a great example. And then another good example would be Radium being able to go and compete with Uniswap with EVM assets. So essentially, as you mentioned, Uniswap is an application that a lot of people know, and partly due to the fact that they're able to deploy across all these different environments because they are EVM. But applications that were built on Solana are now vendor locked into Solana. With this solution, they'll be able to also deploy on these other environments, and then similarly, Uniswap can come and deploy on Solana as well.
Love it, man. Love it. Now, I guess last thing for our community, where are you guys at in development with the testnet and devnets, and what does the next couple of months look like on your agenda?
Yep. So on Optimism, we're live on testnet with the Move virtual machine. There, we're going to be merging the Solana virtual machine and later EVM Parallelized. We're focusing right now on Solana. We've seen a lot of demand from Solana teams wanting to scale their existing applications, especially during periods of congestion. So we're moving very quickly to get Solana onto testnet. There we'll have both the SVM and the Move VM available. Later on, we'll be merging in the Parallelized EVM, and then hoping to move on to mainnet, a few months after that. Obviously, a lot of testing needs to be done on testnet before we can move on to mainnet. But developers very soon are going to be able to deploy Solana VM applications, Move VM applications onto Solana itself that settles on Solana using Sol assets. And very soon as well on Optimism, you'll be able to have SVM, Move VM, so you have ETH liquidity, on SVM and Move VM applications. So yeah, that's the two that are live now. We'll continue moving those in parallel. From developers, this is what we've heard. Ethereum and Solana are the two where most people want to be, so we're tackling these first. But we're also thinking about others, like, as I mentioned, Bitcoin. Ton, I think, is another really interesting one. And yeah, essentially, we'll continue talking to developers and seeing where they want to deploy and helping support there.
Ton is a very interesting one. That has absolutely gone under the radar for so many people and has just caught a lot of people off guard. So, anyway, thank you for the conversation today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking about some of the composability conversation that's in the zeitgeist today, some of the core ethos situations, and even just like the current state of the apps in crypto, kind of where we are headed now, kind of where Lumio is going to be in this kind of modular expansion, all these different chains, apps, and as this application space grows, how you guys can be positioned to take advantage. So again, thank you. It was our pleasure, and looking forward to seeing the developments from your end.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Alejo.